Yeah. So why is China doing this? Because it seems like the U.S., whether you're talking about the U.S. government or American businesses, they seem to like have genuinely wanted to engage with China, do business with China, and the Chinese Communist Party has repaid kindness with enmity.
Well, I mean, I was there on the ground in 1979 when all this started, and so and lived there and lived in Hong Kong, Southern China, and lived in Beijing, and I saw the early days of this, and there was great hope that the vision was that Americans business would go in, help the Chinese while they're making money for themselves, of course, and that this would create pluralism, that there would be the internet would create a demand for the growing middle class to have greater political rights. That they, at one point, dissidents were able to exist and have lawyers, so that the Chinese allowed blossoming of a legal system, early stages of a legal system, and experimented with some democracy at the local level, the elections at villages, for example. And so Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, the three Chinese paramount leaders for 30 years, were willing to tolerate the emergence of a private sector in China, were willing to see the Communist Party somewhat marginalized. No one ever thought the Communist Party was going to go away, but it was willing to allow private sector to exist, allow a state apparatus to have some measure of independence. And so what changed the whole equation was one guy, Xi Jinping, who was from a different wing of the Communist Party, who is a Marxist-Leninist, a true Marxist-Leninist. And he has gradually accumulated power. He wiped out all his opposition in a corruption campaign early on. And now he's disciplined the private sector. Ask Jack Ma and Alibaba about what Xi Jinping really thinks. So, and he has been able, and because American businesses established such large presences in China during those years of hope, he's able now to exploit that and use them as avenues for his own influence in the world. So he changed. I've heard described as one of the worst geopolitical mistakes in the 21st century that we did not recognize early on who Xi Jinping was and what his ultimate objectives were. He means it when he says, when he went to Moscow to meet with Vladimir Putin and said that we're about to do something that hasn't been done in 100 years. What he was talking about was the fall of the Romanov dynasty, the czars, and the Bolsheviks destroyed them. And in China, the fall of the Qing dynasty and the rise of the Communist Party, but as well as the Nationalist Party. But there was the collapse of the world order as it was established. That's what he has in mind. He wants to reorder the world with China at the heart of it. China is the most powerful and nation in every regard. So we've taken us a long time to put that together. We Americans have been slow to recognize the nature of who he is.
Well, I think in many ways it's a blessing that we are seeing what Xi Jinping is doing because, remember Deng Xiaoping talked about reform, but he also killed all those students in Tiananmen. Jiang Zemin talked about reform, but he killed thousands, maybe millions of Falun Gong practitioners. Hu Jintao cut his chops persecuting Tibetans. So there was a lot of horrible things going on.
Well, and also
in
not
China,
just human rights issues in China, but the Great Firewall of China.
That was the Jiang Zemin thing, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and the intellectual property theft has been going on well before Xi Jinping took power.
Right.
So this isn't new.
What's interesting now is we see Xi Jinping, this Marxist-Leninist, as you say, and we should thank him because he's making us all more aware of all the horrible things that are actually happening.
Well, I mean, one of the questions I've had is he overdoing it? I mean, he crushed Hong Kong. He's sending missiles over Taiwan. He's harassing the Filipinos and the Japanese. He's using economic power to punish the Australians for daring to ask for an inquiry into the origins of COVID. He even punished Lithuania for allowing Taiwan to establish a consulate or some sort of presence in Lithuania. So he is asserting power in the world in a way that is creating some resistance, some backlash. I asked myself, what if he'd waited 3 or 4 more years and pursuing a more subtle, long-term campaign and not being quite as brazen, quite as obvious? Might that have persuaded the world not to respond? Might the world still be asleep at the switch if he'd been just a little bit more subtle about it? But for whatever reason, he's a gambling man. He's betting that his increasing assertion of power in the world is going to win, and that it won't create a backlash against him. So this is part of the nature of an autocratic regime, with just one guy really making all the decisions. He's not listening to any voices telling him, "Oh, you may be going too fast, too far, too aggressively. Slow down." But there's no one telling him that.
Oh, because they'd be thrown into
They would be disappeared.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's come out that even with the spy balloon, nobody told Xi Jinping that it had gotten lost over the U.S.
Well, that's the story that's emerging now. But I think that whether it's their intelligence agencies or our intelligence agencies, are trying to make him appear to be blameless, that he didn't really know about it. But I question that if the PLA had a campaign of putting balloons in the near space and going around the world, that Xi Jinping wouldn't know about it. At some level, I find that hard to believe.
Well, so again, this has been happening for a long time. It began it began before Xi Jinping came to power. So I would just wonder if you had any insight to why this has been a thing the Chinese Communist Party has been doing for decades.
Well, we know about that within the Communist Party. There are different wings, different voices within the party, and that there were people who were aggressive and wanted to start projecting more power in the world. But I think that until Xi Jinping, that those voices were marginalized. I mean, there was a book written, 100-Year Marathon, and any number of books have been written about the theories, about the writings of different thinkers within the Communist Party that pointed out that they had these instincts to want to become the hegemon in the world. But it wasn't until, in my view, recent years of Xi Jinping that we've seen it happening at full bore, that now they're trying to execute on all those ambitions they had and never really acted on.
Well, I mean, the two PLA colonels came out with the book Unrestricted Warfare, and late 90s?
Right.
So I think that has definitely been sort of the modus operandi for the Communist Party for quite some time.
They wrote that in reaction to the Gulf War. They saw what our forces were able to do, taking advantage of information technology to really cream Saddam Hussein's forces, and they knew that they had the same kind of old Soviet armaments and old Soviet weapons, so they took that war very seriously, and went to study all the different aspects of how we used IT. And then the other big shock they had was Edward Snowden disclosing in 2013 that the NSA had penetrated the systems that Huawei had built on basis of stolen technology from Nortel. But that was another major shocking blow to them. So they have been gradually, they built a great firewall, of course, but they have been gradually building up their capabilities to the point that now they have these APT groups, advanced persistent threat groups, that target specific countries and specific technologies around the world. And it's not just the Ministry of State Security or the PLA that are engaged in these activities, that even parts of the Chinese government, like the Ministry of Commerce or Ministry of Telecommunications, they are also engaged in efforts to steal technology. So, as one expert told us, that when you look at a country and what their efforts are to steal from other countries or to conduct espionage in other countries, usually it's one or two institutions. It's the NSA or CIA, or in the Russia case, it was the KGB or the GRU. But in the case of China, there are many different players in this space, and making it far more difficult to understand the pattern of what they're stealing.
And didn't China also train North Korea in how to conduct cyber espionage? I think that was in the late 90s or early 2000s.
I'm not sure, frankly, about that. The relations between the Chinese and North Koreans are extremely complex, and the Chinese might have given them some training, but would be reluctant to give them too much because the North Koreans would use it against the Chinese. So the North Koreans' capability is they're smashing and grabbing. They're not engaged in the penetration of cloud systems for multiple years. They're trying to break into financial institutions and steal money because that's what they really need. They need money. So they've also become real specialists in the cyber Bitcoin world. So the North Koreans crashed the Sony servers in Hollywood because of the movie making fun of Kim Jong Un. They did that through DDoS, distributed denial of service, and that's a pretty primitive instrument. They crashed it, and it was obvious that they had done it. So I don't think the North Koreans are quite at the same level that the Chinese are.